the failures of the present invoke this notion that this praise of deterrence, this putting deterrence back at the center of American life, is going to have a renaissance, and that is a neoconservative set of ideas.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. In a wild Ohio Senate Republican primary, there appears to be only one issue that separates the two leading contenders. On the one hand, Josh Mandel, the former Ohio State Treasurer, is part of what appears to be a bipartisan consensus in favor of deepening the U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine against the illegal Russian invasion of its territory. Mandel even expressed a willingness to support a no-fly zone over Ukraine if America's NATO allies committed to the measure. On the other, former venture capitalist and hillbilly elegy author J.D. Vance believes the idea of a no-fly zone is a reckless gesture that could lead to a direct confrontation between the United States and a nuclear power that could lead to World War III. That's a substantial difference, which should be noted, if only because almost all of the commentary about that race concerns the decision of former President Donald Trump to endorse Vance. Today, both candidates are, like most Republicans, ardent Trump supporters. Mandel, who is now backed by Senator Ted Cruz and the conservative advocacy group Club for Growth, was a strong supporter of Trump in 2016 when Vance was trashing him as reprehensible and an idiot. Vance got Trump's nod for a number of reasons, and not necessarily because of his stand on Ukraine, since some of Trump's own rhetoric on that issue has also been very anti-Russia. But Vance seems to speak for many on the right who are befuddled by the way support for Ukraine is considered by many in both parties to be a priority, while the flood of illegal immigrants across America's southern border, one estimate says that the population of illegals has increased by more than 1 million since President Joe Biden took office, is ignored by many in Washington and the media. Trump's endorsement gave Vance an advantage in the polls, and that has led many observers to view the outcome of the primary as a measure of the former president's influence over GOP voters. But regardless of the outcome, we do better to ponder just how much concern over Ukraine is changing the way we think about American foreign policy, and if that shift is for the better. One person who expressed the hope that this would be the case is John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary magazine. In a recent issue of Commentary, Podhoretz made the argument that the war in Ukraine vindicated neo-Conservatism. The word is now more often used as a term of abuse. Vance believes labeling Mandel a Neocon is a telling blow in the aftermath of the failed Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Most of the people who use it now have little understanding of its origin, as a reference to former leftists who were mugged by reality and shifted to the right, or the way neoconservative thinkers helped guide the West to victory in the Cold War and to understand the pitfalls of the liberal welfare state in the late 20th century. But Horace makes the case that what happened in the Ukraine was the result of a collapse of American deterrence that was similar to the failures of the Carter administration with respect to Russia and Iran in the 1970s. Liberal realists, like President Biden and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, opposed the neocons' tough stand against the former Soviet Union in that era. But the neocons really were vindicated by the Soviet Empire's collapse and by the realization that their policy of responding forcefully to aggression, wherever it occurs, was wise. Subsequently, neocons were blamed, somewhat unfairly, for what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's fair to say that in the last decade, a bipartisan consensus in which both the right and the left began to listen to neo-isolationists who opposed further foreign adventures, especially those involving the promotion of democracy, regardless of their merits. One of the most remarkable things about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not so much the general outrage over an indefensible act of aggression. Rather, it is the way politicians and pundits who were once deeply skeptical about the idea of American involvement in foreign conflicts have had a very different reaction to Ukraine. Pelosi is a good example of this, and her proclamation on her recent visit to Kyiv that America stands with Ukraine until victory is won, like Biden's recent demand for regime change in Moscow, aptly illustrated this shift. Both were deeply skeptical of past American commitments abroad, whether during the Cold War era or in the post-9/11 war on Islamist terror. If this represented a belated awakening on the part of both Biden and Pelosi to the need for American strength abroad as a way to deter rogue nations, this would be something sensible people should applaud. But both are ardent supporters of appeasement of Iran and less than enthusiastic about confronting the greatest threat to American security and influence in the form of the Chinese Communist regime. Not to mention their unwavering faith in multilateralism and the corrupt and anti-democratic and anti-Semitic United Nations. So it's difficult to make the argument that common sense on foreign policy now prevails in Washington. There's also some merit to the argument that treating Russia as if it were the former Soviet Union is foolish and has little to do with protecting American interests. Like its Iranian and Chinese allies, Russia seeks the overturning of the Western values that won the Cold War. That makes them dangerous, but the idea that American security, or even that of the NATO alliance, relies on the defense of Ukraine's territorial integrity, regardless of the barbarity of the Russian invasion, seems a stretch. It's not that war until victory, with greater American involvement and via no-fly zones and the shipment of ever more lethal weapons to Ukraine, needs to be better defined. That's especially true with respect to the indifference on the part of these doves turned Ukraine hawks to the possibility of an unwanted escalation of the conflict. After all, Moscow is both a nuclear power and still controls a lot of Ukrainian territory, including the Crimea, which it invaded in 2014 when few Americans thought of that tortured country as a vital ally. Just as troubling is the way the administration is using its anger at Russia as a way to vindicate international organizations like the UN Human Rights Council. No one can explain how kicking Russia off the UNHRC is a victory for the West and its values, while tyrannies like China, Cuba, and Venezuela still sit on it. Were the seeming consensus about Ukraine to lead to a genuine wake-up call about the need for a strong defense and not to tolerate, let alone appease, menaces like Iran, then there would be reason to be encouraged. But that hasn't happened. Aiding Ukraine is a righteous cause, provided that it is done in a way that, like Cold War proxy fights, doesn't involve the possibility of it escalating into a confrontation between nuclear powers. But as a standalone measure, it does nothing to make the United States, or allies like Israel, safer. Stripped of their specific context, the arguments about neoconservatism or isolationism are meaningless and usually caricatures of what these ideas have actually stood for. Neoconservatism wasn't about feckless involvement in all wars. It was an understanding that the West needed to be defended against powers or movements, be they communists or Islamists, who willed their destruction. Supporting the defense of Ukraine doesn't make one a neocon, or someone urging a repeat of the rush to war against Iraq. But neither does questioning whether victory for Ukraine is a vital American interest make one an isolationist. The emotional enthusiasm for Ukraine that currently prevails is not a substitute for a foreign policy that will protect American interests or help defend democracies like Israel. Until the talk of victory is replaced with realistic goals and a path out of this mess that forecloses the possibility of direct conflict with Russia, any idea that common sense is now prevailing in Washington is premature. And now to our interview of the week. Is the debate over the level of U.S. intervention in the war between Russia and Ukraine a sign that Americans are coming out of their post-Iraq, Afghanistan pessimism about the futility of foreign wars? Or is something else behind the enthusiasm for backing Ukrainian resistance to Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion? That's just one of the questions that need to be answered about the future of American foreign policy. The Biden administration's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, its quest for appeasement of Iran, and its inability to come up with a coherent response to the challenge from China have created a perception of weakness that arguably led to the tragic events in Ukraine. But arguments about foreign policy are just part of a broader debate about American politics and society currently going on, both among conservatives and the nation as a whole. Part of it has to do with the way the Democratic Party has fallen largely under the control of its radical left wing, and the Republican Party has been transformed in the Donald Trump era from one that identified with Wall Street to a largely populist movement that is animated more by culture war issues about economics, race, and education than traditional concerns about budgets and American strength. In such a context, what do terms like conservative or neoconservative even mean anymore? And how will all of this impact the relationship between the United States and Israel in the long run? To discuss these questions, we're fortunate to have with us today one of the leading voices of American conservatism and writers about culture of the last generation. John Podhoretz has been editor of Commentary magazine since 2009. A former speechwriter for Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, he was one of the founding editors of the Weekly Standard and a columnist for the New York Post, as well as an author of 3 books. He's a frequent guest on cable news shows where he comments on politics and popular culture. John Podhoretz, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pleasure to be here. Very excited to talk to you.
Thank you. It's great to have you on. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I want to start, and there's so much to talk about, but I want to start by asking you about your essay in the April issue of Commentary titled Neoconservatism, a Vindication. Why do you think, or explain to us, why recent events in Afghanistan and now Ukraine should rescue that term, which in the aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan had become sort of a symbol of American hubris or something, rather than a timeless insight about the importance of a strong foreign policy and the need to deter totalitarians and terrorists? What's changed now, do you think, that ought to make us think differently?
Well, so in the piece, as you know, I rehearsed the history, rather brief history of neoconservatism, which is a model, or as a intellectual tendency, really only began to take shape in the mid-1960s and had 2 faces. There was a domestic face, largely centering on the magazine, the Public Interest, and then there was a foreign policy face, largely centering around Commentary, the magazine I edited and that my father edited at the time, now, more than 50 years ago. And that it's been very hard over time for people to say what neoconservatism is or was, because it never really was anything. It's a misunderstanding. It was never a political movement. It didn't have politicians who ran as neoconservatives. It was a kind of grouping of people who shared a common sense of the ways in which things in America and in the world were going wrong, and how there was a lot of irresolution and a lot of bad thinking that had led to bad decision making and policy making, and what was bad about it and what was wrong about it. And what seems to me, and this is something that I hadn't really thought of until the last 6 to 8 months, that there was a weird confluence. What made the domestic and foreign policy aspects of neoconservatism contiguous and connected was that they were both efforts to explain failures of deterrence. That in domestic terms, the single largest problem in the United States domestically from the 1960s to the 1990s was crime, and that what had failed were efforts to deter crime, and that had been replaced among the intellectuals who talked about criminal justice and incarceration and things like that by a different set of priorities that took away the act of deterrence, the idea that the best thing to do with crime was to stop it before it happened, to use policing and social power and all of that to keep criminals from actually doing criminal acts, not letting them do criminal acts, finding them, and then punishing them after the fact, but creating an entire set of social rules and conditions under which it would be better not even to just try at all. And that was really the hallmark of all criminal justice thinking until the 1960s, when things got broader. And this idea was that there were injustices that were being expressed through criminal acts, and those needed to be addressed. And policing created tensions, particularly with minority communities. So maybe the best thing to do was to not have the cops be present, constantly omnipresent, seeming like a threat to some people, but they should stay in their cars and wait until crimes were committed and then go and try to solve the crimes. And that this was a huge failure of deterrence. And similarly, in foreign policy terms, deterrence was the hallmark of the foreign policy that America engaged in with great success, although took a long time after the Second World War, that everybody understood actually that from Munich onward, that the great failure that led to the Second World War was a failure to deter Hitler at Munich. And that after the Second World War, the question was, how are we going to deter the Soviet Union from its globalist ambitions and its hunger to expand not only its sphere of influence, but its ideological reach? And that the way to do that was to deter them, that containment, as it was called, the doctrine of keeping the communist world around the same size and keeping the Soviet Union in its own ambit without letting it expand so that its internal contradictions could ultimately do it in. That was an effort to deter Soviet advances, deter communist advances and all of that. And it turned out to be very, very successful. And it was hard because that idea then fell out of favor also in the 1970s in favor of working with the Soviets, détente, and negotiating with them to make them better actors in the world and to sort of assume that they could somehow be brought into the community of nations. And to so much to the point that by the time a second arms control treaty was negotiated with the Soviet Union, the United States had agreed to Soviet warhead superiority. In the SALT II treaty, there was actually Soviets were going to be permitted to have more warheads, nuclear warheads, than we were going to have. That's crazy, but there it was, and that was one of the things that Ronald Reagan reversed, or that the Soviet advances in the late 1970s compelled America to reverse, which was we couldn't really work with them. We couldn't work with them well, and they had a different set of understandings of what they wanted from the world than we wanted, and that the ultimate failure of deterrence then ended up being Iran, the fall of Iran, and the taking of the hostages in Iran, and the Soviets taking Afghanistan. All of which they did because we, in my view, we pulled out of Vietnam, showed ourselves to be weak, showed ourselves to be a paper tiger, showed ourselves not to be determined to prevent, like, the criminal deterrence. And that if you look at the last 17 months of the Biden administration, you see an eerie set of parallels. The bug out of Afghanistan, which I think even now most liberal observers would say contributed to Putin's idea that he could move on Ukraine without really serious consequence. And that was a huge failure of deterrence. And then we have the crime wave in the United States. We have this enormous crime wave because liberals decided that deterrence, which had been the great way to end the crime surge of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s through broken windows policing and CompStat and various other things, that ended up restoring the idea that the best way to deal with crime was to prevent crime from happening in the first place. And that we then moved into a view that cops were the problem, not criminals, and crime wasn't the problem. It was systemic racism that was the problem. And the deterrence there failed again. And then we have had, in New York City, we have a 40% increase in violent crime and burglaries and all across the board. So it just seems to me that the solutions that helped us win the Cold War and defeat the crime wave in the 80s and 90s, the failures of the present invoke this notion that this praise of deterrence, this putting deterrence back at the center of American life, is going to have a renaissance, and that is a neoconservative set of ideas. Again, there are no neoconservative politicians. There's no neoconservative, there aren't neoconservative clubs of youth, and
Yeah, the whole term is kind of nonsensical. As you once told me, it's like, you're considered neoconservative. I was, that made sense when applied to, an older generation that were, Trotskyites at City College in the 1930s. It had nothing to do with, people who had been conservatives their whole lives. There was nothing neo about us.
Right. Except that there are different kinds of perspectives on what it is to be conservative, right? So there are conservatives who believe that, the exercise of American power abroad is corrupting. It's corrupting, and we need to heal ourselves. It doesn't work, and we need to fix ourselves before we can fix anybody else, right? That's this kind of the trad con that's now very, very much part of this national conservative or tradition trad con world. Yeah. And then we have sort of own the libs transgressiveness, and there are all kinds of things but what was specifically interesting and different about neoconservatism from the conservatism of the 70s, 80s, and 90s was that the establishment conservatives had a certain type of loathing of the idea that good and evil had a place in our understanding of the world, and that we couldn't make deals. If we made deals with the Soviets or made deals with the Chinese or things like that, that we were compromising ourselves morally and spiritually. It was bad for the American character, and it was actually a betrayal of the American character, and that it was going to do no good anyway, because they weren't going to behave, because they wanted us to fail and they wanted to succeed, and they weren't interested in the rewards that we could give them, unless we could give them rewards that they could take without having to live within the rules that we thought we were promulgating for them to obey. And I think basically, like I say, we're back there now, and it's still the case on the right that this notion that what we need, and it's kind of a moderate idea. It's a much less ambitious program than a lot of other programs, even though people seem to think that neocons, want to conquer the world and take over country, force democracy on everybody. I think this is a misunderstanding that, again, the binding glue is this idea that what you want to do when you are facing bad actors in the world is deter them. You don't want to replace them. You don't want to destroy them. You need to deter them, and that if deterring them will slow them down and might actually cause them to fall apart, and it will prevent others from following in their footsteps. And that's probably the best you can hope for in a fallen world where, there are going to be more bad actors than good actors usually.
Yeah. I think the points you make about like the sort of the wisdom of that insight and the folly of American weakness are totally on point. But I guess the question I have is that really what is going on with respect to the enthusiasm for defending Ukraine, which seems more driven by the horror of the toll of war there, or disgust for Putin, as well as the way that Ukraine became something of an American political football because of the attempt to impeach Trump. I'm not really sure when Nancy Pelosi, goes to Kyiv and pledges, American, support until victory over Russia, whatever that might mean, and I don't think she has any idea any more than I do. Where are we with that? I mean, I think the insight is good, but I'm not sure that an administration that is at the one time, on the one hand, very enthusiastic about, deterring Russia, but also equally determined to appease Iran and not sure what to
Right.
do about China has really absorbed this insight and
Oh, I don't think it's absorbed the insight at all. I mean, I this is my view is that what I'm proposing here, which is that this neoconservative doctrine of deterrence has been vindicated by what's gone on in the last year and a half, let's say. That's my opinion. I don't think that the nation has come to accept or acknowledge this, and certainly the Biden administration hasn't at all. But its tone on, I mean, I think that its behavior, the things that it's done, and the way that it's handled the war in Ukraine since the surprising level of success of the Ukrainians has been very measured and very proper and has built in a very responsible and sober way. But I don't think that that the administration has in any way coherently articulated why. I mean, because we're back in the question if you say, well, the one nation can't just go in and take over another country. It's like, really? You want to promulgate that doctrine? Because where's the limiting principle then? You can't just say that because there are 204 countries on the planet. In any given moment, two or three or four of them are trying to take over and swallow up another one. Why is Ukraine different? In fact, you would say that it's a less safe example of trying to spell out that doctrine because our rival or the person that we're lining up against has nuclear weapons. So that's stupid. Like if you went into, if you're dealing with, Eritrea or something like that, like you can go in and make this point and have overwhelming, have the overwhelming force to do that. So I think and Biden saying he can't stay in power and Putin's, I mean, it's all very incoherent, and the incoherence is bad because it creates long-term either bloated expectations, or it's going to be very easy to get disappointed by the results. And I think the most important thing you mentioned is Iran, because and I still remain, I don't understand this, and maybe you can, because I know you at JNS have done such good reporting on this, but how can this still be? How can the Iran deal still be, if it is, I don't really think ultimately it's even a live option, because once it moved to the center, this contradiction would take place. But we can't simultaneously effectively be at war with Putin and then ask him to be the guarantor of Iran's nuclear materials and be the guarantor of the deal we have with Iran. It's insanely incoherent and bizarre. And like I say, I think basically it's dead because it's not the minute that they were going to announce a deal, the 48 hours afterward would be like some kind of nightmare from which they couldn't awake, because suddenly they're going to have to pivot and say, no, it's okay. Sergei Lavrov it's fine. He can handle that while they're, trying to kill 10,000 people in Mariupol. It doesn't make sense
doesn't compute. And yet, as long as Robert Malley is in charge of Iran policy in this administration, I wouldn't underestimate the chances that at some point, last week it was interesting. I found it very interesting that last week, sort of the Israeli, the Bennett government in Israel was leaking information to its favorite journalists saying, see, our policy is vindicated. There isn't really going to be another Iran deal, so we were right not to pick a fight with Biden. And that same day, Jen Psaki was making noises about, Iran's getting closer to a nuclear weapon, which I interpret as we're not done trying to get this deal done. Yes, and it's completely incoherent. But no, I don't think they have any. I don't think they are anywhere close to resolving the contradictions and the conundrums inherent in that. But they're still in charge, so who knows what's going to happen.
I mean, I think the central thing I would say politically is, again, since there's no neoconservatism except as a kind of view of the world that is markedly like you deal with the world as it is to some extent. So, if 56 years ago, it was like the New Deal is here to stay. People on the right should stop arguing that there shouldn't be there shouldn't be a social safety net. There's a social safety net. What's more, it's a good thing. However, when you try to extend it too far and make it too airtight or something like that, that's bad, and bad things happen because you have to deal with the world as it is. But that as the right tries to figure out where it's going after Trump, or even with a renewed Trump, right? But I mean, after the first Trump administration, let's say, that this is a reasonably solid middle ground, as long as you don't start in with that means you want to invade Iraq and you want to, I mean, the joke to me is there's this idea that George W. Bush's missionary evangelical second inaugural address that said that we need to, basically expand democracy in the next century all over the globe, and that is our mission, has now gotten to be seen as the neoconservative. It's like that was the millenarian neoconservative hysteria. Like, a neoconservative didn't write that. Mike Gerson wrote that speech, who was an evangelical Christian who went to Wheaton College. He's not some ex-Trotskyite who went to City College. That's not. This is a misunderstanding of who the neoconservatives were. What's more, the joke on neoconservatism is, and this is a joke on us, is we're sitting here. The one thing you could have said that bound all neoconservatives was an extraordinary skepticism about the Arab world. I mean, innate hostility to Israel, like the oil embargo, everything. Like this was like a sinkhole for hostility toward the West, hostility toward Western Jews, and everything like that. And here we are, and it's 2022, and Israel and Saudi Arabia have so made, private common concord that now, liberals want the entire transformative foreign policy in the Middle East held up because of the murder of one guy in Turkey. And so this entire change that will fulfill a century of American, or not a century, 75 years of American hopes of a new kind of way forward in the Middle East is held hostage to a single really bad act. And that's a joke, because now we're like, no, make peace with Saudi Arabia. Stop doing this. Like, this is too good. This is too, the notion that people like me would be saying, don't, we had a piece Bret Stephens wrote, like, dear President Biden, don't screw up the Abraham Accords. Like, that was not anything that I had on my bingo card. Here's what's going to happen in the second half of the 2010s. Like, Israel, the UAE, and effectively Saudi Arabia were going to become kind of allies, and that Jews were going to be having Pesach programs in Dubai. Like, that was not that's as big a shock to me now as the fall of the Berlin Wall was, in the 80s. So it's not like it's a predictive system, neoconservatism. It doesn't see things that might happen. It's just, if you deter, if you hold back, which is what the Israelis have been working to do with Iran for 20 years, and where our failure to deter Iran then really threw the Israelis and the Saudis together, if you deter, all kinds of creative things might happen that you can't game out. You just need to try to make sure that the bad guys don't advance. So,
well, that's a good segue to my next question, which is, the part of the debate, to the extent that we can dignify it with the term of debate about neoconservatism, which is, it's like J.D. Vance calling Josh Mandela a neocon as a term of, ultimate, it's like a dirty word, is sort of the transformation of the Republican Party under Donald Trump. You were, like many of us, deeply critical of Trump in 2016. How much did your opinion of him change over the course of his presidency? What do you think about the arguments that his personality and unpresidential behavior notwithstanding, his administration was, at least until the pandemic, an example of conservative success, as well as historic support for Israel? What do you make of his attempt also to play kingmaker in various GOP primaries like the one in Ohio? And what also, I should say, what do you think of some people, including people that both of us considered friends, who believe that opposition to Trump, both before and after the Capitol riot, is seemingly the sole defining issue of American politics?
So my low opinion of Trump's character and comportment are unchanged, and I think not only my low opinion, but I think they destroyed. I mean, I think they and the inconstancy that he has showed, that his inconstancy in relation to the pandemic, are what brought him down. And so, I think that criticism, not only my own disapprobation, but the notion that this was not a good way to be a president or a political candidate, was in fact validated by what happened. I think that a friend of mine, a very serious hedge fund guy, once said, he's chaos, but in chaos can sometimes create weird opportunities. And I think, particularly in relation to the Abraham Accords, the fact that he had absolutely no connection with any previous policy choices, and therefore was able to look, for whatever reason, because Jared did this or David Friedman said that or whatever, I don't know what, but for whatever he could have said, why don't we do this? Because he didn't have 25 years of going to the Council on Foreign Relations being told that you couldn't do this, or he didn't have 20 years of experience of talking to people behind the scenes who would explain that, well, you could never have a Sunni with a Shiite, you could add this with the blah. He didn't know, and he didn't know. It's like, okay, well, what the hell?
For experts, and
yeah,
didn't know, any other Republican who had been involved in, policy just wouldn't have felt free to do it.
So someone comes to him and says, you know what? The whole way they've been doing this is totally screwed up. That's what you said in 2016. I got an approach. We got a phone call from the Mohammed bin Salman. You know what? Maybe we could do X, Y, and Z. He's like, sure, why not? Or, I hate the Iran deal. Let's pull out of it. It stinks. Like, nobody else would have done that stuff because everyone else had skin in the game and didn't sort of, knew better than to try. And so that's very exciting. And what's more, not only exciting, but should be a model for everybody to follow, including Democrats, if they could ever see their way clear to following it, which is, why can't you, in policy terms, ask the question, why are we doing things this way? Does it really? It's been 25 years of this. Is that going to work? Or, looking at, 2 years after Black Lives Matter and crime's up 40%, maybe we did this the wrong way or something. So in that sense, Trump was a vital creative force, and deserves praise and all of that. And David Friedman's book is pretty. I just read Jared's now writing a book. Avi Berkowitz is writing. We're going to know a lot about the Abraham Accords and what happened here that is going to be very valuable and will be a very valuable lesson to future, which is not, I think, anything that anybody would have expected from the Trump administration and its handling on foreign policy, which in other realms, including China and North Korea and stuff, was very confusing and very haphazard and not, and destabilizing. And NATO, NATO, it turns out, apparently is going to survive and thrive, but kind of the hostility to NATO and all of that was, I think, really, really bad. And obviously the pandemic was, the pandemic did him in, not only because it might have done anybody in, although I don't think so. I think that had he not stood at the podium and wandered off talking about bleach or saying I don't want testing because the numbers are going to make me look bad. But if he had gone out to the podium and said, "This is rough. This is a this is a very difficult situation," if he had taken more credit, and this is a very interesting thing, he had taken more credit for the very creative vaccination drive strategy. Of course, the timing of that wasn't that great, right? Because we knew they were coming, but they didn't come before the election. But there was part of him, there is a very serious anti-vax part of his soul and spirit and psyche, and that the anti-vaxxers were part of his original base, and he didn't want to offend them. And so I don't know what to say. Now let's talk about the friends, our friends who have made opposition to Trump the be all and end all. It's terrible. I mean, it's been very sad for me to watch. It's got about it a monomania that is a complete reflection of Trump's monomania, and it's also like this solution to everything, right? It's like if all we have to deal with this, or everything else is going to go haywire. We're going to lose our democracy, and we're going to, and then essentially deciding, okay, I'm making common cause with the Biden administration. Well, that's great because the Biden administration is a disaster. You want to then discredit yourself. But it's also like, it's going really badly. Like if you say you've got to double down on your commitment to the Biden administration because Trump is coming back. It's like, well, then go. He stinks. Like, it's a terrible administration. They're doing everything wrong. They're 20 points underwater on the three most important issues facing the country that everybody cares about. Like, get yourself some distance from them. This is not a good strategy that you've adopted. And in fact, in the end, it's not that Trump was the worst thing ever, because it's an interesting binary choice here. Look at Trump and look at Biden. So Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. Trump wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. But Trump didn't pull out of Afghanistan. And Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. What was it that held Trump up? The one thing that held Trump up that people said to him that must have resonated was, this is going to make you look weak. You pull out, it's going to make you look weak. No one's going to people aren't going to say you ended a war. They're going to say, this makes you look weak. You lost to these guys. If somebody had said that to Biden, and Biden had second thoughts about this, I don't know where we'd be in 2022. It's very possible that there would not have been a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, I agree. So that's my reevaluation. I don't know. I don't want Trump to be president again. I think that would be very destructive. I think the question is, can the positive aspects of Trump's legacy, can a DeSantis or somebody, can somebody learn lessons from the positive aspects of his legacy, including being resolute about fighting the other guys and not letting them define the terms of the debate, which obviously DeSantis seems to be uniquely good at. It doesn't have to be DeSantis. It could be, I hold no particular brief for anybody, but obviously we're not going back. It's not going to be, Rubio. It's a Rubio, Jeb, Paul Ryan person isn't going to be the leader of the Republican Party in 2024. It's going to be somebody harder edged and rougher and a culture warrior and all of that. The question is, can you do that without, telling 50,000 lies in the course of your presidency? And I would say the answer is yes. So it would be better that than the other. But
yeah, well, leaving aside the question of the fact that right now it looks like it will be a binary choice between, another dose of Trump or another dose of Biden, assuming Biden, is still standing in 2024, or either of them are still standing in 2024. Yeah. I guess my question is the critique of the sort of George W. Bush era GOP, which was perceived as more aligned with Wall Street, disdainful of the working class voters, and paying only lip service to the beliefs of the party base about cultural issues and economics accurate? I mean, earlier you mentioned the NatCons, National Conservatives, who, at least in my reading, seek to put forward an approach which they think is more rooted in defending American interests. Others speak of the need for a common good conservative approach. What do you think about these ideas and sort of what's going on within the conservative movement, to the extent we dignify it with that term right now?
Well, I mean, so common good conservatism is socialism, so I don't consider it conservatism. It's socialism. It's the idea that you use state power to foster positive moral and social ends. So that's socialism. Sei gesund to them. This is what we really needed, is to come back to socialism in order to make in the case of Adrian Vermeule, the professor at Harvard Law School, in order to install the Pope as the leading political figure on the planet Earth. So, which, by the way, would be an interesting trick for these guys. They will, if this is actually what they want, the Pope right now doesn't like them and doesn't share their ideological predilection. So this seems to be a self-defeating approach that Vermeule is taking. But, look, they're radicals, and radicals tend to have commonalities with other radicals. So their thing is, the Democrats want to use state power to foster their cultural aims, right? They want to push transgenderism and all of this. So we'll use state power to foster our ends. And my view is state power shouldn't be used in this way, period. And that is, it's a violation of conservatism. And they're not conservatives; they're socialists, effectively.
That's a point that our mutual friend Saurabh Amari now makes, is that in a neutral, being neutral, which is what I actually always thought conservatism should be, that we shouldn't use state power, has led to a situation where, okay, so people are free to do bad things. His example, drag queen story hour, and that sort of the bad drives out the good, so that you can't really let be neutral about all of this stuff. What do you think about that?
So Saurabh and I talk about getting interior. So Saurabh, who of course worked at Commentary for a year and a half, after he left and he went to work at the New York Post, where you and I both worked with him. He was our editor. He and I ended up being in a debate at Commentary contributor Mayor Sully Soloveitzic's synagogue, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, about religion and society. And there was a Mormon guy there. It was Saurabh, me, and a Mormon, and Sully. And Saurabh said, there's bad things, and liberals use their social power to get bad things, and we want good things. Not everything is the same. So they're bad and we're good, and our view is we need to work to because they will never stop, and because people need to be guided toward the good. That's what we need to do. And I said, look, I'm part of a very, very significant minority. There are 2% Jews make up 2% of the population of the United States. And I look over at Europe and I see moves made by people where Jews are significantly less than 2% of the population to outlaw the practices that make Judaism, circumcision, kosher rules of how to slaughter animals so that kashrut can be followed, and all of that, particularly circumcision, which of course is the first act. It's the originating act of the Jewish faith, is circumcision. And I look at this, and I look at Jewish success in the United States and all of that, and my point is, I just want to be left alone. Jews, as a very significant way, understand we just need to be left alone. We're gonna do our Brit Milah, and we're gonna keep kosher. We'll have schools, and we'll have our own schools, and we'll follow our own rules, and just let us be. Don't come in and try to regulate us or control us and all of that, because that way lies destruction. And So this was the fundamental. I said to him, look, you're a Catholic. There are 60 million of you in the United. You're the largest single denomination in the United States. Catholics used to have a lot more power before the sex scandals sort of like removed a lot of their political and social legitimacy, the leaders of the Catholic Church. But you're part of the largest denomination, so maybe this is thinkable that you get to run things. But I'm never going to get to run things, and what I see is secular encroachment on my faith, and I need the principle that guides America to be leave people alone to the extent possible. For me to follow my religion, and I think also and there was, as I said, there was a Mormon guy there, for Mormons to follow their religion.
Well, for conservative Christians in general, they were relying on, sort of their main issue is supposedly religious liberty because of the encroachments on their ability to practice their faith.
Exactly. And so of course the religious liberty stuff, the interesting thing of course is that Sorob's big fight was with David French, and what was David French's main issue is the defense of religious liberty, and his view is the way you defend religious liberty is to make the Big Ten point that religious liberty is part of is a weird part of a liberal idea about diversity, that you need to have a general understanding that everybody gets to live together and pursue their needs and their interests. I see that in a conservative frame as, yes, government being neutral, or at least you don't want to empower government too much, because people will say, ugh, what do you mean you take these babies and you cut off skin on their penises? That's disgusting. That's disgusting. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. Somebody stop that. You say, well, we kind of gave birth to Western civilization. This has been going on for, thousands of years, and it's the way we define our. This is the defining act in the Torah of what it means to be a Jew. Like, slow your roll. Don't be so presentist. And you pierce your ears. Maybe that makes me sick. Like, it's like again, it's the limiting principle question. And the thing about, ultimately, in the end, the problem with TradCon, I mean, there are many problems with it, but in this respect, it is that they are effectively accepting the legitimacy of coercive power as used and saying, you know what, we want that too. We want what you have. You have coercive, but we want to take it away from you and give it to us. And in the end, they won't succeed. They will just legitimize the use of coercive state power. So it's bad.
Speaking of, as we just referenced before, the idea of what is the the end all and the be all, the Democrats drift to the left. It's adoption of sort of an equity agenda across the board, which is what the Biden administration is doing, sort of in a stealth way, which I think is a far more important issue than most people realize, which is rooted in ideas like intersectionality and critical race theory, which by the way are permission slips for anti-Semitism. To me, this seems like the most important ideological battle facing us, and yet we both know that much of the Jewish community, for one, is not interested in fighting that battle, and it's not clear to me how some of the sort of internecine battles within the conservative movement are enabling it to have a coherent response elsewhere. Where do you see this debate going?
I have a great article in the June issue of Commentary by a young Orthodox Jew named Tal Fortgang on this very subject. It doesn't really deal with the Jewish question. I mean, being disappointed in the Jewish community's refusal to take up the cudgel for the things that are most important to it and its own future is, of course, our lifelong sorrow. And we can only do what we can do and say what we think we need to say to deal with it. I think I still go back to this thing that Abe Foxman said years ago when somebody said, I can't remember what there was some cause that he was talking about, and somebody said, well, most of the Jewish community doesn't agree with that, or something like that, or a majority or plurality doesn't agree with that. Like, why are you why are you saying this as head of the ADL if they don't agree? And he said, I represent the Jews who care. Which I always thought was very interesting, because, of course, demographically, Jews would want to, like most groups, would want to claim as many people as possible. Right? You want to say, oh my God, look, all these people are identifying as Jews. You wrote a fantastic piece for Commentary 8 years ago about, I think 8 years ago, about the Pew, the catastrophic success of American Judaism as measured by the Pew, the big Pew poll that came out, I guess, in 2012 or 2013, right? Which was, look, the community it's amazing. 5.8 million people, and people are very proud to be Jewish. And 31% of them say that Christ is divine. So you're like, wait a minute, So what Foxman was saying, and what is true, is that there are two kinds of Jews. Like, there are the Jews for whom their Judaism is a central part of their lives, and there are Jews for whom it's like the spice. It's like the garlic or the cumin or something like that. It gives life color and flavor, but it's not at the center of their lives. And if it somehow were to go away, not that Judaism would go away, they wouldn't miss it, or it would be, they would miss it the way we miss Yiddish, but it wouldn't really affect them particularly. And then there are people like us and people who are far more committed to their faith than I am, or have it far more central to their daily life than I do, for whom these are life and death issues. And ultimately, it's the people who care that count here. It's the people for whom Judaism has meaning and isn't just an ethnic, assignation. In the United States, it's great. You're now, there's suddenly everybody's proud to be Ukrainian. It's like these moments where it's, something great happens and you're like, I'm Ukrainian. Even Jews are like walking around. Jews who, like, for 100 years were like, I hate those Ukrainians, are now like Mila Kunis, the Jewish actress who was like, I'm from Ukraine. It's like, really? When did a Jew ever say they were from Ukraine? Like, I understand it's a more complicated story than that. But I mean, like, so for a lot of people, this is just kind of like an ethnic coloration. And for the people who matter, it is the most important thing in their existence. And it is the it is the profession of their deepest beliefs, and being free to teach their kids their deepest beliefs and all of that. And that's really going to come as a central, that is the culture war of the next 10 years, because are you going to make a yeshiva, are you going to compel a yeshiva that wants a accreditation so that its students might be able to go on to, a legitimate college or like a secular college or something like that, to have gender affirming surgeries as part of their animating doctrine or something like that? Like, this is, the rubber is now meeting the road here. And so what Jews, as in polling terms, think is of no concept. I mean, is not really what matters.
Yeah, well, it's a much broader issue in terms of, and indeed, something more for us to think about than the failure of organized Jewry or of Foxman's success rate at the ADL, is the question of just, is there a blowback now? Is the tide turning against, critical race theory and, the transgender ideology in the schools? Is that an issue that is really going to take hold and drive some of the debate in the next two elections? That's an open question. What do you think about that?
I think it is. I think you are seeing bits of data and bits of evidence that suggest that there is a historic set of reversals starting to happen based on these matters. Last poll I saw Democrats with a 5 or 6 point advantage on who's better at handling education. That used to be a 25 point advantage. It was historically 2/3 to 1/3, something like that. We beat our head against the wall on this for 40 years. We need school choice. We need this. We need that. You need to let people, competition in the system and all of that. And it seems like just in the last 2 years, you combine critical race theory with the galloping march of transgenderism and the evil response of the teachers' unions to the pandemic and the hostility they showed toward their own students and concern for themselves and not for educating and all of that. And you see this very serious, deliberate effort that we all made to talk about how best to educate the children and all of this never got any purchase. And then suddenly this becomes a hot button issue that helps drive this 11-point shift 13-point shift in Virginia that gets Glenn Youngkin elected. One of the two major issues that got him elected. If that's not a sign of a huge shift, and then of course you have this Hispanic, the numbers in the Hispanic community going haywire toward Republicans and even African Americans. Again, in the end, when people go to the polls, this may not really be reflected. Things may end up where they are, but I don't know that I've ever seen a shift quite like this, where you can really feel the public moving toward you. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, when this is what I mean. Like we're politically conservative Jews. So as I've always said, like we're a minority of a minority of a minority. If the entire Jewish community started to shift in our direction, we'd be like, whoa, what's going on here? It feels a little like that on education and on a lot of these social justice matters. That the public, and Christine Rosen's written about this for commentary also, this whole thing with parents, like we've been saying for years, parents believe in parents and all of that. And then you have 2 years in which these Pangendra at the head of our educational establishment say parents don't matter and we screw parents and I hate parents, and they're caught on tape saying this. And then suddenly there's a parent movement and parents are voting as parents. And again, in this latest, in some poll I saw last, I think it's the Gallup poll, if you have children in the household under the age of 18, the party breakdown, 60-31 Republican to Democrat. Now, it's a remarkably small number of kids, by the way, between the ages of 0 and 18. In some ways, it's like 48 million kids. They're probably, we're only talking about 40 or 50 million people. I mean, but if they all vote and they're all Republican, like that is the ultimate killer app. If that number holds, it may not hold. I mean, it may just be evanescent, but
we'll see. But that does have the power to sort of change the math in certainly in a lot of suburban areas, which flip to the Democrats. One more issue I want to get into. I mean, there's so much we could be talking about, but the whole debate, and it relates to our profession, journalism, the debate about disinformation, in which the Biden administration and much of the journalism establishment have been quick to label right-wingers as liars and peddlers of disinformation, and yet they were themselves the ones who put forward the whole, Russia collusion stuff, who, deep sixed the Hunter Biden laptop story. Recently, there was this conference, which you saw that at the University of Chicago, where a lot of the people themselves who had been peddling what you could arguably say was disinformation were the ones talking about disinformation, and Jeffrey Goldberg, who headed it up for the Atlantic, said that people calling them out for his hypocrisy was itself disinformation.
Yeah.
And sort of the broader question is that we have, sort of the American public square now being controlled by internet companies, social media, Silicon Valley oligarchs who have been clearly putting their thumbs on the scale. At least, perhaps that will change with Twitter, with Elon Musk. We don't know. That really changes, a lot of these arguments. That's another one of these transformative I think, debates, because people have really lost faith in in the outlets that they were always told to believe in.
I think it's a fantastically positive development in this sense, which is that the sole purpose of proposing the notion that disinformation is governing the practices and habits of bad people in America who are willing to believe bad things, and that this needs to be countered in part by government action, for example, and all of that, is transparently an effort to say, I mean, I think it just seems very transparent. We no longer have to be fair. I'm not even saying objective or anything. This is now a cage match. There are no rules anymore. They have to be stopped. This goes back to Trump, the sort of the anti-Trump monomania. He has to be stopped, or our country is finished. And that then goes down the line to the disinformation has to be stopped, because it's all part and parcel of the same structure that is causing all of this to happen. So basically, we're allowed to take off our gloves. We're allowed to punch people in the kidneys. We're allowed to sew their mouths shut. We're allowed to throw them into free speech jail because we have a higher purpose. And that's a gift to us a little bit, because it's so transparent that the ordinary way that they've dealt with our getting outraged at them is to say, what do you mean critical race theory is playing a role in America? That's just an academic idea in graduate school seminars. It's not, no one teaches that. Please, you're so hysterical. Don't you want kids to know about the legacy of slavery, right? That's where we're like, what are you talking about? They already learned about the legacy of slavery. What they're being told is and it's like, no, you're so hysterical. Why are you so crazy, right? They're now saying it's good to silence people. People should be silenced. That's helpful to us. I'm sorry. They've stopped gaslighting, and they've basically they've pulled the curtain back, and we're seeing who they are. And I think that's a positive. What's more, it's a positive also on the right, in the sense that it's not just crazy people on the right who are making this argument now. Do you know what I mean? It's it's not just Mike Cernovich and, Charlie Kirk and people like that who you have to somehow, who say other things that are, I think, despicable. We're all in this. It goes from, Barry Weiss, is a liberal. She's not, we're all in this. And when they say, there are these ideas being peddled I don't like or I disagree with, and they're so dangerous that everybody who does them, it's okay for them to be suppressed. Oh, and it's all private anyway. I mean, you can't control Twitter. That's not fair. Twitter's a private company. I was unaware that they were so concerned with the rights of private companies. It's the first time I've ever heard any defense of the rights of private companies practically ever from anybody on the left. But so they've created this counter assault, and they're digging in their heels. And I think it's a huge mistake. I think they should sue for peace and say, but they're not going to.
They're clearly not. I don't think that's the way it's going to go. They're going down with the ship on that one.
Yeah.
John, I want to thank you so much for coming on and giving us the benefit of your insights on all these issues. It's been great. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us on Facebook, the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.